In this Explain Everything, I'm going to explain the transport of oxygen in the blood. First of all, let's start by introducing the characters. We have the hemoglobin molecule. This is the protein, the transport protein that will be carrying the oxygen. And we have the star of the show, which is the oxygen. Pulmonary respiration. The partial pressure of oxygen is going to be relatively high in the alveoli, so it will diffuse down its gradient into the blood, at which point the hemoglobin molecule will pick up that oxygen and transport it to the cells. At this point, hemoglobin will then drop off or release the oxygen, and during systemic respiration, there's going to be a higher partial pressure of oxygen outside of the cells compared to inside, and the oxygen will diffuse into the cells. At which point cellular respiration occurs, the cells will produce CO2, and although I'm not showing it in this Explain Everything, appreciate the fact that the CO2 will then diffuse out of the cells, and once again the hemoglobin molecule comes in, picks up the CO2, and returns it to the lungs. So the transport is going to be oxygen is going to be transported to the cells, and CO2 will be transported back to the lungs. Remembering that the hemoglobin molecule is going to be doing both. So it is going to pick up the oxygen, drop it off, pick up the CO2, and drop it off. One other point to appreciate is the fact that the transport of oxygen is due to the oxygen binding to the heme groups on the hemoglobin molecule to form oxyhemoglobin. Okay. When it picks up the CO2 is not binding to the heme groups, it's binding to the amino groups on the polypeptide chains of the protein and is called carbaminohemoglobin. Now let's look at the equilibrium that occurs as hemoglobin is picking up the oxygen. So we have the oxygen plus the hemoglobin going to oxyhemoglobin. Okay, this is an equilibrium. So now let's just take a look at what's going to happen if we should increase the concentration or the partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, so if we increase oxygen, as any equilibrium will do, it will shift to the right and therefore picking up the oxygen, okay, and forming our oxyhemoglobin. Now let's look what happens if we decrease the partial pressure of oxygen. In response to that, the equilibrium will now shift to the left, and hemoglobin is now going to release, or let's say, drop off the oxygen. Now let's relate this to pulmonary respiration and systemic respiration. At the lungs, the hemoglobin molecule will pick up the oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin. That oxyhemoglobin then transports the oxygen in the blood to the cells, at which point it will then dissociate and release the oxygen for the cells to be able to utilize. So you can see here at the lungs it is picking up the oxygen, and at the cells it is dropping off. So pulmonary respiration, okay, we're going to have the hemoglobin picking up, and systemic, we will have it dropping off. So pulling all this together, let's take a look at once again, is that here it is picking up the oxygen, here it is dropping off the oxygen. We said in the previous slide that picking it up was going to be pulmonary and dropping off will be systemic. Let's relate that now to the equilibrium in terms of the shift of equilibrium to the left and to the right. What we had previously discussed was that if we increase oxygen, it will shift it to the right and form oxyhemoglobin. Okay, that is going to be picking it up, and that will be pulmonary. Does it make sense that in the pulmonary we're going to have a high level of oxygen because we have just had the oxygen diffuse into the blood from the alveoli? Okay, conversely, we can look at the opposite where we have a decrease of oxygen. Okay, and this is going to be at the cells because they've utilized all the oxygen in cellular respiration. If we have a decrease, what we said is that the equilibrium will shift in the opposite direction, and what that results in is a dropping off of the oxygen due to the dissociation of the hemoglobin and the oxygen. Now let's take a look at the oxygen-hemoglobin dissociation curve. As discussed in class, the hemoglobin molecule exhibits positive cooperativity. It has 4 binding sites for oxygen, and once one oxygen has bound, it is more likely to bind another, and then another, and another until it is saturated. Okay, this ability to bind, or the likelihood that will bind, is we're going to be calling it affinity. Okay, so the more oxygen available, the more that binds, it's going to increase its affinity. So on this curve here, you can see that it says on the axis here that is the O2 saturation of hemoglobin. As we increase the saturation of hemoglobin, we increase its affinity. So what I'm going to do is just change the axis here and just think of it in terms of affinity. And then on this axis we have the oxygen levels in the blood, the partial pressures of oxygen. Now let's compare the affinity to the pulmonary versus systemic partial pressures of oxygen. At the pulmonary, we will have relatively high levels of oxygen because the oxygen is just diffused into the blood from the alveoli. So that's going to be point A. And then B will be the systemic, where partial pressures of oxygen in the resting cell will be quite low because they have already utilized the oxygen. So looking at the affinities now, the systemic versus the pulmonary, you can see that the pulmonary affinity is going to be higher than that of the systemic. So let's go back and just discuss for a second the meaning of this. If we increase the affinity of oxygen or the hemoglobin for oxygen, it's going to want to pick up the oxygen. If we have a lower affinity, it will be more likely to drop off the oxygen. So what did we just say here is that the pulmonary has a higher affinity than the systemic. So the pulmonary wants to pick up the oxygen, whereas the systemic is going to tend to drop off the oxygen. Does this make sense? At the lungs, do we want to pick up the oxygen for transport to the cells? Yes. At the cells, do we want the oxygen to be dropped off? Yes. So the actual hemoglobin molecule, because of this positive cooperativity, okay, works in a way that it will pick up the oxygen where we want it to pick it up and drop it off where we want to drop it off. Let's look at what would happen if, for some reason, the partial pressure in the air, for example, high altitude. Okay, if the partial pressure of oxygen decreased, therefore the partial pressure of the pulmonary oxygen would be a little bit lower. So let's say we go all the way down to 60, for example. Okay, and what you'll note here is that the difference in the actual affinity, okay, does not change that much. So what this area here is called is a margin of safety, in that the oxygen carrying capacity of the blood does not significantly decrease within a certain range of partial pressures. So that means that if you increase altitude to a certain point, your oxygen carrying capacity is not going to be altered because hemoglobin changes its affinity. Okay, we already have less oxygen, so that's going to affect the diffusion of oxygen into the blood. What we wouldn't want to happen after that is that the hemoglobin, even though the oxygen was there, wouldn't want to pick it up. So this here, called the margin of safety, okay, allows us some flexibility in picking up oxygen when the partial pressures decrease. Now beyond that, you'll see here, when we're getting to the resting cell, that we're starting to get into the more steeper part of the curve, and the affinity actually does start to significantly decrease. Now let's compare the affinity at rest compared to exercise, where the oxygen levels will have decreased because the oxygen demand is higher and the cells are utilizing the oxygen. Okay, going here, we're now going to see that there is a significant decrease in the affinity at this point. And now we're into the real steep part of this curve, okay, this sigmoid curve, which means that a small change in the pressure, partial pressure of oxygen is going to result in a large release of oxygen because the affinity has decreased to that extent. Okay, is this what we want to have happen? Do we want the hemoglobin to start dumping off the oxygen when we need it under exercise conditions? Yes. So once again, hemoglobin molecule has evolved to pick up the oxygen when we want it to not drop off too much should the partial pressures change, drop off enough at rest, and then drop off even more when we really need it when we are exercising. Now, as if all that wasn't amazing enough, the hemoglobin molecule has also evolved in a way that under certain conditions, the affinity for the oxygen will be altered even further. So first of all, let's just take a look at this sigmoid curve and look at what happens now is that I'm going to shift the curve to the right. Okay, so we're just shifting it in that direction. And what I want to do now is just compare what the affinities are at any given partial pressure of oxygen and compare the black curve to the blue curve. So let's just say for argument's sake, we're just going to start here. Okay, so at that partial pressure of oxygen, okay, the blue affinity is here and the black affinity is here. So what we note is that as we shift the curve to the right, the affinity decreases. Once again, let's just review. As we decrease affinity, okay, we are going to increase the release or the dropping off of oxygen to the cells. Well, when do we want that to happen? We've already discussed is during exercise. So during exercise, already we've looked at the hemoglobin molecule under lower partial pressures of oxygen is going to have a significantly decreased affinity and therefore will drop off the oxygen. However, during exercise, three other things are happening. Okay, we could potentially have the buildup of lactic acid, which is going to increase hydrogen ions and decrease the pH. We could have an increase in CO2 levels and an increase in temperature. So next, let's look at what is the effect of these three variables on the affinity for oxygen. Well, it just so happens that the curve, the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, okay, shifts to the right under these conditions. And what we previously discussed was at any given partial pressure of oxygen, as we shift the curve to the right, the affinity decreases. So again, hemoglobin tends to release the oxygen because of the decreased affinity under decreased pH, okay, acidic conditions such as the buildup of lactic acid, okay, increased metabolism which would increase CO2 levels, and increased temperature such as during exercise. Before we end, there is one more evolutionary trick that hemoglobin has up its sleeve, and that is the difference between maternal and fetal hemoglobin. So here is the maternal hemoglobin, and here is the fetal hemoglobin. Now you'll note here is that the curve has shifted to the left. Okay, so here is the fetal. It's shifted to the left. And if we take a look now at any given partial pressure of oxygen, we will see that because we've shifted it to the left, the affinity has actually increased. Does this make sense? That fetal hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen. In my books, that makes total sense.